earlier in your opening remarks about, and I've never heard this before, focusing on discourse rather than retraction. And when Dr. Masterjohn spoke in the last session, very creative ideas about how we could open things up. In the FDA, for example, so instead of open source medicine, open journals, open drug approvals. What a fascinating idea. And so the one thing that I didn't hear mentioned, though, was informed consent. That's a phrase that I have not heard yet today. And so I wanted to ask the panel, how do we, and Dr., is it Jason Locasale? So you talked about making science based on merit. But my problem is, as someone who was in the academic system as a PhD neuroscientist, I wrote my first grant, got to NIMH. It wasn't reviewed, but they sent it back and said, well, can you make the data open source? I turned it around in 2 months and got a perfect score on my grant proposal from NIMH. But I wasn't on infant brain development. I wasn't allowed to ask about vaccines. My grant would have never been considered if I put in there what I really wanted to study. But my question is, how do we use this transparency, this focus on transparency, focus on discourse instead of retraction? So maybe we don't retract drugs. We're not doing that yet with mRNA vaccine, but we create an environment where we can have more discussion to then show the merit on the science. Because I don't see that happening. Someone else's good science is someone else's bad science. And I need to better understand how I can do that as an independent researcher.
And I think they tie into the last point where you talked about the patents and the IP, and I think that part of science, I mean, there's one issue regarding the financial incentives associated with it. The other issue is the justification for lack of transparency that often is brought upon, where we say, oh, we can't disclose this, there's IP rights. So I think there's a general issue about transparency in terms of these sorts of policies. When I talk about merit, I don't mean merit by what a study section at NIH. I mean, we need to think more with a lot of discipline and intent in terms of defining what we mean by merit. We have technology now in the form of AI, in the form of blockchain that could potentially give more open data kind of ideas, and I think implementing these, like for instance, I would imagine an AI eventually can get to a point of what is really original data. I think AI can do that much better than peer review probably can, and I'm not talking about AI that's trained on PubMed that's got biases associated. I'm talking about AI that's objectively assessing certain basic criteria. They could be criteria among scientists that disagree with one another, but there's a long conversation to be had there. But I think really figuring out what we mean by merit, how to define it, and how to get better ideas about what it is, I think is really important.
Yeah, we reward on the incentives that we give, and so if our incentives are based on health outcomes, predefined health outcomes, we're going to reward on that. If it's on the amount of grant money that you bring in and that kind of thing, a number of publications, these are orthogonal to health outcomes. But I did want to address your informed consent point. Informed consent exists in two places: with your doctor for personal care and then also during research.